This is our second event in our series run by the Center for European Studies this semester on the theme Democracy in Danger, ? And today it's a real pleasure. We're very fortunate to have with us Yascha Mounk, who's going to speak to us about whether American democracy is in danger. And let me just tell you a little bit about Yascha to introduce him. Yascha is a man with a few different titles right now. He's a lecturer on government at Harvard. He's also a fellow in the political reform program at the New America Foundation. And he's also a fellow at the Transatlantic Academy of the German Marshall Fund. And we were talking that soon, just next month, I think, he's going to be moving over part-time, at least, to the UK to be working on a new think tank, running a program, a think tank Tony Blair is setting up to look kind of precisely at this topic, how we can defend democracy against rising populist forces. And so that's going to be an exciting new chapter in his career. Yascha has an undergrad BA in history from Trinity College, Cambridge. He's born and raised in Germany, though, and then came over to the US for graduate school. He has a PhD from Harvard. He's already published 2 books. He has another one coming out this week, and then another one early next year. So he's quite prolific. Just the one coming out next week or so is called The Age of Responsibility, Luck, Choice, and the Welfare State. And then early next year, there'll be a book which is most related, I think, to the themes we're talking about today and to a lot of writing he's been doing recently in op-eds in the New York Times, in his column in Slate magazine, in a host of other publications. And that's called The People versus Democracy, How the Clash Between Individual Rights and Popular Will is Undermining Liberal Democracy. And that'll be published next year by Harvard University Press. And as I alluded to, beyond his academic writings, Yascha has been really engaged as a public intellectual, writing in op-eds in major newspapers, magazines, and doing a lot of media interviews about these themes. So we're very fortunate to have him with us to talk today about whether American democracy is in danger. Over to you, Yascha.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come here to talk to everyone. And I have to say, I don't think ever in my life I've been so grateful to an audience simply for showing up. That's because I don't think I've ever held a talk when the weather outside has been quite so nasty. So thank you so much for braving it to come here. I grew up in Germany to Polish parents, and so who sort of lived through communism and so on. So when I was growing up, they would always be telling these sort of weird Eastern European jokes about communism, and I never got them, and I never got why they were supposed to be funny, and they never seemed relevant. But I've been thinking back to one joke that I've heard sort of at the kitchen table since I was 4 years old over the last months, and it's very simple. It's set in the Soviet Union, and a man is walking home from work late at night, and he sees another man who's clearly incredibly drunk and standing over the gutter throwing up. And he walks over to the man, pats him on the shoulder sympathetically, and says, I completely agree with your political analysis, comrade. So for reasons you can understand, that seems relevant to our world at the moment. So I want to do 2 things. I want to sort of question 2 assumptions that a lot of political scientists and a lot of the wider public, a lot of pundits, a lot of ordinary citizens have been making about the world, about democracy for the last decades. So the first assumption is that wealthy democracies are stable. That once democratic consolidation is sort of a one-way street, so that it's pretty difficult to become a democracy. It's not very easy to transition towards this regime form, but once you've become a consolidated democracy, once, roughly speaking, you are affluent, you've changed government for free and fair elections at least a couple of times, democracy becomes the only game in town. Everybody wants to play by the rules of democracy, and at that point, democracy is there to stay. You really don't have to worry about it anymore. And it seems to me that recent events call this in doubt in various ways. I hope I'm not going to give you a fright now. So one is obviously the election of Donald Trump, But there's a rise of a liberal populace that goes well beyond that. That's not only happening in the United States, but it's happening in large parts of Western Europe, in Central Europe, even in places that are so otherwise different as Turkey and India and Russia. And at the same time, you have a sort of rapid erosion of democratic norms when things that all different parts of the political spectrum could agree on suddenly get called in doubt. When suddenly you are talking about jailing political opponents or levying charges against political opponents that aren't backed up with any evidence. When, the use of the filibuster in the Senate goes from being very rare 30 or 40 years ago to being very frequent and then to being abolished. And so I think we have to ask what we make of this new world, whether we can still stick with the initial assumption that wealthy democracies are stable, that democratic consolidation is a one-way street. And so I'm going to be asking in the first part of the talk whether democracy might now be deconsolidating. So the first thing to say is that political science doesn't yet fully reflect these new circumstances, that our empirical ways of looking at this, empirical indicators like polity and Freedom House, are so far largely unchanged. They haven't reflected these developments yet. And there's a good reason for that, because what they do is to measure the extent of democratic rule. They are asking, are there still free and fair elections at the moment? Are there independent courts at the moment? But I think that in order to answer some of the questions that naturally arise from this political moment, we actually need an indicator of democratic deconsolidation. We need to ask a question of how robust democratic rule still is. And that's one of the things that I try to do in my work. So stepping back a moment, what should be indicators of democratic deconsolidation? How should we think about it? Well, if we're saying democracy is consolidated, it's robust, it's stable when it's the only game in town, what does that mean? Well, I think it means at least three things. That people strongly support democracy as a political regime form, that they're all in favor of democracy, that it's important to them to live in a democracy, that democracy is a good system, all those kinds of things. The second thing is that is the degree of openness to authoritarian alternatives. So when democracy is the only game in town, you shouldn't be willing to play the authoritarian game. You should say that having a strongman leader is bad, having army rule is bad, and all those kinds of things. And the third is whether or not anti-system parties and movements are strong in the political system. So whether people who think that the system not just needs to be reformed in a little bit, you need policy change, but people who actually really are railing against the system as such have any real voice in your politics. So these are three indicators that I want to briefly look at. All right. Is democracy consolidating? Let's start by looking at support for democracy as a regime form. Well, it seems to me that there's quite strong evidence that that is now declining. So one of the striking things is that younger citizens ascribe less importance to democracy than older citizens. This is taking World Value Survey data, as I will be doing basically throughout this talk, and it's looking at the question, how important is it for you to live in a country that is governed democratically? And it's looking at the number of people who say, really important to me, essential, 10 out of 10. And you see that people born in the 1930s and the 1940s on the top left of this graph say it's really, really important. And when you look at people born in the 1980s, millennials, and it's much less. It goes from over 2/3 to less than 1/3 across generations. And this is a global trend. You see a surprisingly similar development in many countries around the world. Not in all countries, and there's a bit of a scholarly debate about that going on at the moment, but certainly in places as varied as Sweden, Great Britain, New Zealand, a very similar trend to what you were just seeing. Younger people being much less invested in living in democracy than older people. Now, just to take you through a little bit of that debate, it's very exciting when you're a young scholar and for the first time everybody's debating your paper, so everybody's been debating my paper and trying to take it down, and there's been various criticisms, and I want to just implicitly engage with a few of them. So one is that they're saying, well, look, perhaps this is an artifact of the way you've posed the question. Essential to live in a democracy, 10 out of 10. Well, okay, perhaps a lot of people now say 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10. Is that really something to worry about? Okay, so this is a graph that I didn't produce, but somebody on Twitter produced in debating this. And they're saying, okay, what if we just take 8 to 10 as people who say important, 4 to 7 as people who are in a sort of neutral range, and 1 to 3 people who really don't want to live in a democracy, right? And what you see is that the people who really are against democracy, it's actually doubled sort of over generations as well, but it's very low, right? But when you look at the people who are essentially indifferent, that really has gone up quite significantly. And the people who think it's really important has really gone down quite significantly. So it's not just an artifact of looking at 10 out of 10. This still looks pretty worrying. Similarly, you might think that it's about the wording of a question. How important is it to live in a democracy? Kind of a weird question. Well, it depends. It turns out that when you look at a slightly different question, it's looking bad as well. So this is the number of people who say that democracy is either a bad or very bad way of running the country. And what you see here is, again, that younger people on the right-hand side of this graph, 16 to 24-year-olds, are much more likely to say that democracy is a bad or very bad way of running the government, both in the United States and in Europe. So this is not merely a question of a wording of a question, and nor is it simply an age effect. Because you see that when you compare the gray lines to the black lines, the number of people who think democracy is a bad system of government has gone up over the last 20 years. In the United States, at every age group, fewer people thought that than do now. In Europe, among the very old, it's improved a little bit. That has something to do with authoritarian overhang. But for most age groups, again, it's gone up, the number of people who think democracy is a bad system of government. All right, let me skip this one. So what about alternatives to democracy? Are people actually not just saying it's not important to me to live in a democracy, it's a bad system of government? Are they even open to real alternatives to liberal democracy? And again, the answer seems to be yes. So this is all of the countries where we have time series data on whether they want whether they think a system of government in which there's a strong leader who's not checked by government by elections and parliaments is a good system of government. And you see comparing the wave in the mid-90s of data to the wave in the early 2010s. The exact year varies a little bit from country to country. It's gone up in most countries, and it's gone up quite strongly in a number of countries that we would think of as consolidated in North America and Western Europe. Even when you ask a more extreme question, like whether you think army rule is a good system of government, it's gone up quite a lot over the last 20 years. So the data for the United States here is especially striking. When you ask people in 1995, do you think army rule is a good system of government? 1 in 16 Americans says yes. Now it's 1 in 6. And when you only ask young and affluent people whether army rule is a good system of government, it was 6% in 1995, and it's 35% now. All right. So the last question then is, what about voting behavior? Is this just some weird thing about how people answer questions in surveys? They're somehow more critical in some abstract way, but when it comes down to it, they are just as averse to voting for extremist candidates. And as you sort of all intuitively know from having a sense of the political news in North America and Western Europe, that's not the case. I find this graph from Ron Engelhardt and Pippa Norris very useful. It's just showing the strength of anti-system or populist parties in their language since the early 1960s to today in Europe. And what you see, I think, disabuses us of a number of things. I mean, first you see that it's really gone up quite strongly. This is separate graphs for center left, for far left and far right populist parties. But both have gone up strongly over the last 40 years. And the second is that you really see to what degree this is a long-standing problem. This is not just an artifact of the Great Recession. It's not just the last 5 years. It's a problem that's been long in the making. All right. So just to summarize a couple of key points, the best evidence does seem to suggest that many established democracies are now deconsolidating. But that raises a question of whether that actually means that democracy has become less robust. Is this a good indicator, a good measure of the kind of thing that I want to look at? And so I just want to take you through a couple of case studies quickly. Now, there's no ideal case. There's no democracy that was thought to be completely consolidated that has experienced some of these indicators, and we can fast forward and see what happens to the system. Because democracy has historically been quite stable, right? That's why we're now in a new intellectual world where we have to figure out whether that's still the case. But two of the closest countries are Poland and Venezuela, right? So in Poland, for example, it was considered fully consolidated by a good number of political scientists a few years ago. And there's good reasons for that. There was 5 turnovers of government through free and fair elections since the post-communist transition in the early 1990s. There's a robust civil society. There's critical media. There was very strong economic performance. Poland's GDP increased very rapidly since 1990. And yet the country is now veering away quite rapidly from liberal democracy. There's concerted attacks on the Constitutional Court, which has essentially been packed and neutered. There's attacks on the free media, including the revocation of licenses, strong arming of private companies into selling it, complete colonization of the state media. There's attacks on the political neutrality of a bureaucracy, including a midnight raid on a government-affiliated think tank early in the rule of a new political party, and so on. And the argument that I want to make is that though this has taken political scientists by surprise, the indicators of democratic deconsolidation, the kind of measures that are now flashing red for the United States, could have actually, to some degree, allowed us to predict this. So even before the current government took over, 1 in 6 polls thought democracy is a bad or very bad way of running the country. 1 in 5 thought the military rule was a good system of government. And of course, there had been a strong presence of anti-system parties, including not just Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, who have now taken over, but also Samoobrona, Ruch Palikota, and other movements before the last elections. I could go through the same example in Venezuela. Essentially, Venezuela was thought to be one of the best examples of democracy in Latin America until the mid-1990s. Before Hugo Chavez took over, all of these indicators were already looking very bad. And obviously, since then, you've seen very rapid deterioration of democracy in that country. And a few years from now, we may be able to add one more case study. Let's hope that that's not going to be the case in the United States. But I think taking this together, there is now strong evidence that democratic deconsolidation is a good predictor of future slides in the extent of democratic rule. And so the second question becomes, how do we make sense of this new political world? What does this mean? How do we conceptually understand what we're now facing? And here I want to go to another assumption, taking off in some ways my training as my hat as a combative politics person, and to some degree putting a sort of political theory hat on, for there'll be some empirical things as well. We tend to think of liberalism and democracy as mutually reinforcing. But they now, it seems to me, are pulling apart. So somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who's now attacking a wonderful institution, Central European University in Budapest, is proudly calling himself an illiberal democrat, somebody who is prying these two things apart. And at the same time, many countries have also come to be seen as less democratic by their own citizens, who are saying, you're not really allowing us to have our voice heard. So I think we need a new conceptual framework that can better capture the rapid transformation that is now taking place. And so it seems to me there's 2 components of our political system. None of this is groundbreaking stuff. Liberalism, a set of institutions that effectively protect civil liberties and minority rights, and democracy, which I translate somewhat minimally, more minimally than the supposedly minimalist definitions in literature, as a set of electoral institutions that effectively translates popular views into public policy. I think if you define these things in a simple way, you can more clearly think about how they might be coming apart. If you bake everything into the concept of democracy, it becomes difficult to understand this political moment. And my fear is that these 2 components are now starting to drift apart, creating, in essence, 2 new political regime forms. So you start with something like liberal democracy, and using the political scientist's favorite tool, the 2x2, you can make the system less liberal, and you end up with something like an illiberal democracy, which is where Hungary now seems to be headed towards. You can also make the system less democratic, in which case you end up with something that I'd call undemocratic liberalism, and some people like Kasmud have made similar points. And then obviously if you have a system that's neither liberal nor democratic, you're in a dictatorship, right? All right. So why is this a helpful way of talking about it? Why are the concepts of illiberal democracy and of undemocratic liberalism helpful ways of thinking through this problem? And why should we be talking about illiberal democracy at all? Because some people like Jan Wilhelm Müller argue that illiberal democracy doesn't exist, that that's not a helpful way of thinking about it because once it's no longer liberal, there's nothing democratic about a system. Well, I think that to understand this rise of far-right populism, we obviously have to understand that it's illiberal. My basic model of populists is that they say politics is a very simple thing. The reason why you're not getting wealthier, the reason why, all of these immigrants are coming in and you're unhappy is not that the world is complicated and so on. It's that the elites are self-serving and they're corrupt and they're more interested in minorities than they are in you. And so all it takes to solve all of the problems is for me as the populist to really represent the people, to really speak for the average guy and come in and solve all of the problems. And I'm going to be able to do that because politics is really simple. I'll make good deals or whatever and all will be good, right? Now, the problem is that politics actually isn't simple. And that once you have these people in office, they're going to do two things. The first is that they have an exclusionary conception of the people. They claim, as Müller puts it, a moral monopoly of representation, where who they represent is only a part of the actual people, the people who they think are the real people. And so they obviously end up with policies that are against minorities. But the second is that because they think that they, not only that they have a restricted sense of who the people are, but they think that they alone speak for the people, anybody who disagrees with them becomes illegitimate as an enemy. They become so-called judges. They become enemies of the American people. And so these populists also always set themselves against liberal institutions. They set themselves against independent institutions, from the media to independent courts to a neutral bureaucracy. So in a clear way, they're illiberal. I also think, though, that there is a real democratic energy behind these movements. So the first thing to note is that these movements are different from earlier generations of the far right. I tweeted this morning, I'm just thinking of it because it had the same color. So this is Frauke Petry from the Alternative for Germany. I went and did some reporting in Germany and went to a bunch of her campaign rallies, spoke to a lot of her supporters. The Alternative for Germany this morning put out a poster that quotes a headline from Die Welt, a German newspaper, saying Jewish citizens concerned about rise of political Islam, and sort of on the top left of that poster. And then the main thing in the poster is, we of the Alternative for Germany are standing in solidarity with our Jewish fellow citizens. Okay. Now that is a cynical ploy. This is a party that thinks that any way of remembering the Holocaust is basically, a form of shame on the German nation. Right, they want to outlaw circumcision, which would essentially make religious Jewish life in Germany impossible. This is completely untrue and cynical, but it is a very, very marked departure from earlier generations of the far right. Earlier far right parties in Germany, like the NPD, proudly were anti-Semitic. And you have the same phenomenon in France. Marine Le Pen, I don't buy the shtick that she's suddenly in favor of gay rights and suddenly friendly to Jews, but it is a real departure from the rhetoric and the self-presentation that her father used to have, right? And so I think that recognizing that is important. They're not the straightforwardly anti-democratic far-right movements we had before who openly said we want to abolish democracy. And one element of that is the huge emphasis on referenda. So when I went to a campaign rally by the AfD, you walk in and the first thing you see is a lot of Swiss flags. And that's weird because for a nationalist movement, you wouldn't think that they walk around waving the flag of a different nation. And why do they wave Swiss flags? Because the Swiss have referenda. And in those referenda, they get to do things like outlawing the building of minarets. So that the Swiss constitution now reads, and I quote, "There's freedom of religion in Switzerland, ... the building of minarets is forbidden." Right? And the story that Petry tells in her stump speech is that Germany is a semi-democracy. That back in 1949, when we passed the Grundgesetz, the sort of basic law, they told us we would have two laws for elections. One to represent our representatives in the Bundestag, and one to have referenda. But they never gave us the referenda. And so Germany is a semi-democracy. What we want to do is to make it a full democracy. Okay. So I think that to grapple with what the energy behind this movement is, the term liberal democracy is important because they are claiming to be democratic in an important way. And we'll talk in a moment about whether or not that is a stable regime form, whether or not it might not deteriorate into something else. But I think to understand its nature, a liberal democracy makes sense. Okay, so on the one side of Matuba 2, you had liberal democracy. On the other side, you had undemocratic liberalism. So what does that mean? Well, I think it's a system in which individual rights, minority rights, rule of law is mostly respected. It really is quite a liberal system. But it has deep undemocratic characteristics. One of those comes from the fact that a lot of policy areas are taken out of democratic contestation. So, for example, you've had the huge expansion in the role of constitutional courts and the rise of constitutional courts. Of 23 democracies in the late 1920s, 9 had constitutional courts with the right of judicial review at the time, and 22 out of those 23 now have it today, with the Netherlands basically having it, but sort of being complicated. All right. There's a rise of independent central banks, which in many countries didn't used to be independent and also had much less of a political role, who now have many more tools at their disposal and have become more independent in most countries. There is the expansion of the role of bureaucratic agencies. So Max Weber described it a little more complicated than that, but is often summarized as saying, bureaucracy just applies general rules to particular cases. That's what a bureaucracy does. That's no longer at all an adequate description of what bureaucratic agencies do. When you think especially of independent agencies like the FCC, the EPA, the Consumer Protection Bureau, or in Europe, the European Commission, they are law-making entities of sorts, which are actually responsible for the majority of rules in our society at this point, right? And then finally, you obviously have trade treaties in international organizations and all those kinds of things. And when you take all of these things together, it seems to me that one element of this undemocratic liberal system that characterizes some of our present-day reality is that all of these different policy areas have been taken out of democratic contestation, restricting the role that elected representatives of the people actually play. And then there's a second element, which is that the legislatures reflect popular views less than they used to as well. And I think that there's sort of three reasons for that. I mean, one is sort of a straightforward increase in the role of money in politics, especially campaign donations in the United States. There's a broader point here about lobbyists, and there's an even broader point about political milieu. In part, those things are bound up when you have to spend up to half of your time, as some representatives in the House of Representatives do, fundraising. You also end up hanging out with people all of the time whose views you come to share. So it doesn't in any way have to be a matter of conscious sort of falsification of your own preferences. It's partially that the milieu you're in sets your preferences. There's also a deeper development here. When you look at Europe, a lot of social democratic MPs used to come out of trade union movements with deep roots in those movements in local towns. A lot of Christian Democrats used to come from religious communities, from smaller towns who were the notables there, and they would likely go back there after they lost office. Now they come from big cities usually, have gone to university, have had professional careers, are probably not going to go back, move back to the places that they represent. So I think there's a real sociological detachment from legislators to constituents, which is quite different to what we had 40 or 50 years ago. All right, so there's sort of two questions that come out of this, right? One of them is whether there might be a kind of vicious cycle between these two things. That as you have the rise of forms of undemocratic liberalism, people feel angered, they feel that we are no longer getting a real voice here, and so let's vote for these populists because at least they'll shake things up or drain the swamp or whatever. And then the other way around, political elites are telling themselves, well, look, if the people vote for these crazy populists and want these crazy policies, we have a duty here to stand up for the rights of minorities who might be mistreated. We have a duty to stand up for policies that make sense, and we're not going to destroy our country. So let's insulate more and more of a political system from these popular pressures. And so one fear is that there might be a vicious cycle between a liberal democracy and undemocratic liberalism. And another fear, and this goes back to sort of a point about liberal democracy, is that it might degenerate into dictatorship. That it might turn out that a liberal democracy, for I think it's helpful to think of it as its own kind of regime form while it lasts, may eventually turn into a more straightforward form of dictatorship, because you are eroding the independent state institutions, the free media, the rights of the opposition that you need in order to preserve the system. And that's clearly what seems to be happening in places like Hungary and Poland, what's already happened in places like Turkey and Russia, and we're only just starting to understand what's going on here. And then there's a really speculative question about whether undemocratic liberalism eventually becomes unsustainable as well. That if you really want to protect undemocratic liberalism against the rise of a liberal democracy, eventually the only way to do that might be to become less and less liberal by undermining protest rights and outlawing parties and so on as well. We haven't seen that happen, perhaps in some places like Thailand or Turkey, but that's a little more speculative, but I think it's helpful to think about. All right, so I want to make sure that we get some real time for Q&A, so I'll sort of speed through some of the other chapters in my book, essentially, that I'm writing. But just to give you a little bit of a taste. So what I've said so far is that wealthy liberal democracies may no longer be as stable as they once were, but indicators of democratic deconsolidation are strong predictors of deterioration of democratic rule, and therefore that liberal democracy may slowly be giving way to these two new regime forms, illiberal democracy and undemocratic liberalism. So a few points to make is, one, it seems to me normatively unacceptable to sacrifice liberalism. It also seems to be normatively unacceptable to sacrifice democracy. And so we have to think about how to reconcile these two. And the best way of doing that is to think about the causes of a crisis of liberal democracy, going back to that chart of a long-term trend of a rise of populist parties. What is it that causes that long-term trend, and think about some possible remedies. And so a lot of what I do in the book is to talk through some of the causes of populism that seem plausible to me. One of these is economic anxiety. I do think it's a fundamental fact of our politics that all through the history of democratic stability, you've had this very rapid improvement of living standards from one generation to the next. So from 1935 to 1960, it doubles. From 1960 to 1985, it doubles again. And now, since 1985, it's been flat. And I just think that fundamentally transforms how people think about politics. We never loved politicians, we never completely trusted politicians, but we used to say, you know what, give them the benefit of the doubt. In the end, they've held up their end of the deal. Fine. And now they're saying, no, I worked hard all my life, and I don't really have anything to show for it. I'm not any better off than my parents were. My kids are probably going to be worse off than me. So let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. Now, a lot of the time that manifests itself in a more complicated way, right? So I don't think that it's as easy as saying, if you're poor, you're going to vote for populists. If you yourself have had bad economic experiences, you're going to vote for populists. That's clearly not true. There's a lot of data to show that. But I do think that is a big background factor of our politics, that economic anxiety. And I think that in part drives a second factor, which is sometimes thought of as standing in competition with this. But these two things, not only is the world not monocausal, but it seems to me obvious that these two things can reinforce each other. And that's a sort of rebellion against ethnic and different forms of pluralism, where you've had the slow transition in Europe of mono-ethnic, monocultural countries into multi-ethnic ones, and a lot of the population does not want to accept that. And you've had in the United States, a country that's always been multi-ethnic, but that's had a clear racial hierarchy, becoming slowly more equal, and again, parts of the population accepting that, and parts of the population rebelling against that. And finally, you've also had a sort of revolt of the regions. So I think a lot of this, the one voting pattern that's very consistent is that rural areas end up voting for populists much more strongly than urban areas, nearly everywhere. And in many places that has economic roots, that they actually are doing less well than they used to, whereas the urban areas have started doing much better. It's also something about a cultural divide. And then finally, sort of new media as the thing that holds a lot of this together. Where my way of reading the influence of social media is not that it sort of inherently favors populists or anything like that, but that there was a big technological gap between the kind of resources that elites had at their disposal, because they had effective control over mass media, over newspapers, television stations, and so on. They were based in the metropolitan centers. They were run by highly educated people who tended to have centrist or left of center views. And now you have a system in which people can, there's no longer gatekeepers in the same way. People can propagate their ideas much more easily through social media and so on. And so you get a much less consensual media landscape that allows much more voice to the extremes. And so it's not that new media necessarily favors populists, but it does close the gap, the advantage that political insiders had over outsiders. And so in dictatorships, that might be good for the democratic opposition, but in democracies, that is good for people who used to be sort of beyond the pale and who can now organize more easily. And so one of the questions is what to do about each of those things. How can we actually tackle those? And I'm now starting to think about that, and that's going to be a part of a book, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. I'm more optimistic on some of these parts than others. I mean, I don't think we can get rid of new media. That's not going to happen. But I want to spend the rest of the talk just briefly bringing it back to the question of democracy in the United States. So is Trump a danger to American democracy? And is American democracy now in danger? Well, clearly, the indicators of democratic deconsolidation are there. And they're as strong in the United States as just about anywhere else. But what's going on in a more sort of day-to-day political sense? How do we make sense of the current political landscape? Well, I think Trump is a clear example of a liberal democracy. I think the one hope is that he's no ideologue, that where somebody like Viktor Orban in Hungary or Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland or Marine Le Pen in France have a very clear sense of what they're aiming for, know that they're trying to get rid of liberal democracy and build something like a liberal democracy, like a hierarchical democracy. I don't think Trump shares all of those same instincts. He has the same imaginary of a populist. All of the things I was saying about the nature of populism earlier obviously apply to him. But I don't think that he has a very clear idea of wanting to undermine neutral institutions and so on. And so the hope is that he will sort of stumble around for long enough and not quite go in the right direction that he is missing a lot of his political capital, a lot of his opportunities. And the other point is that civil society has woken up to the dangers that Trump poses, and that there's a lot of the federalist nature of the United States, which means that state governors and so on can do something against him as well, and that there's a big protest movement, a very active media, and all of those things. So putting these things together, it seems to me that there's now essentially three scenarios. The first scenario is Hungary. That is that actually, despite the federal nature, despite the resistance, despite Trump not being an ideologue, he will manage to undermine free media, undermine the neutrality of state institutions, pack the Supreme Court. One day when the Supreme Court says, you know what, we don't like this law that you've passed, he just nominates 10 Supreme Court justices. Or he simply says, look, I'm not going to abide by what the Supreme Court says. What are you going to do? How many divisions do you have? Undermine free and fair elections. I think that is a possibility. I think it's not the most likely possibility. I don't think we can exclude it yet. But it is a possibility. The second, perhaps most likely scenario is on the model of a late Roman Republic, where what's going on is a slow decline of institutions, a slow loss of trust, a slow loss of democratic norms. And you have moments of crisis in which you have populists, populares, in office who are actively dismantling the system. And then we lose an election, and somebody sort of sane comes back for a number of years, and it's looking sort of a little bit better. But some of the underlying drivers of this mean that another person in that populist mold gets reelected, And over a period of 40 or 50 years, with no very clear dividing line, you lose the really sort of the democratic nature of a system. I think that's a danger that I take very seriously. And then there is the chance of rejuvenation. There is the hope that young people who have fallen out of love with democracy are recognizing at the moment how important it is to live in a democracy because they're seeing the makings of the alternative. There is some hope that mainstream GOP politicians who rode the populist wave thinking they can control it now recognize that they can't control it, and if Trump gets defeated handily or leaves the political stage, eventually they have a moment of reckoning and actually realize how important it is to reaffirm democratic values. That, I think, is the optimistic scenario, and that's the scenario we have to work towards. I'm not sure how likely it is, but we'll see. So I just finished a draft of my book on Sunday, so I'm still slowly recovering. And so, yeah, it's People versus Democracy, how the clash between individual rights and the popular will is destroying liberal democracy, which is frankly a mediocre name. So if somebody has a better suggestion in the name, I would love to take that. And I look forward to the Q&A. And I think because we're filming this, you're supposed to definitely speak into a microphone, for this is a small room and I'll hear you anyway. But thanks.
Do you have the microphone there? Yep. Okay. So, yeah, I'll just pass this around so they can get you recorded. But any questions? Just raise your hand. Yeah.
All these surveys about people saying, a larger number of people saying they don't much care, put much value in living in a democracy. Are there follow-up questions like that asked whether they think, is what's called a democracy not really a democracy anyway, and things like that? In other words, are they really saying I don't want to live in a democracy in any sense of that word, including sort of an ideal vision of what a democracy would be, or are they really talking about a feeling that what's called a democracy, like in the U.S., has really become an oligarchy, and that's what they're saying they don't particularly value?
So there is a question that basically is saying, sort of like on a scale of 1 to 10, how democratically do you think your country is ruled? And
Democratic is a democracy.
yes, like is your country on a scale of 1 to 10, is your country ruled in a democratic manner or not? Something like that. I forget the exact wording of the question, but it's something to that extent. And I did look at whether or not that's predictive of voting for populists, and it turns out that it is. So I think in Germany, for example, in 2013, I'm saying these numbers off the top of my head, so they're not going to be exactly accurate, but it's something like out of sort of 8% of Germans said that they would vote for a populist party in the survey. And out of the people who thought that the country is not ruled democratically, it was more like 24%. So it definitely explains part of the populist energy, but it doesn't explain all of it. And I think that's part of the problem, right? That because they feel like the country isn't really ruled democratically, they become more open to these alternatives. And one thing that I want to emphasize is that it's not the wording of a question, right? But I agree that the sort of question about how important is it to live in a democracy is a little weaselly. But when you're saying, I want a strongman leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections, or you're saying, I think army rule is good, those clearly are an embrace of something that at least de facto is going to end up being a real alternative to democracy. So because of that, I'm not too worried that it's sort of, they have something very different in mind. Because there's these other questions that show very similar trends that don't seem to have that problem.
Other questions?
So I'm interested in the idea that you're seeing this as a decline from stable liberal democracy, and I'm wondering whether that was true, and thinking particularly about disenfranchised groups. So some of this decline in trust in democracy has coincided with actual increase in things like franchise, or in the U.S. Voting rights for African Americans that have been realized. So I guess my question is this really a decline or just a shift in who is enfranchised or feels enfranchised? given previous surveys wouldn't have included people?
Well, so I think, first of all, the surveys don't just include enfranchised people, right? So, but also, really what you're seeing here is a decline over the last 20, 30 years. And probably in the United States, for example, the number of people who've been enfranchised has gone down over the last 50 years, right? You probably had a high point in the immediate aftermath of the civil rights legislation, and then, from voter ID laws to the closing of polling stations and so on, actually a sort of slow decline since then, right? So I'm not sure that you can explain it that way. I do think that in Europe, I think it has something to do with the arrival of a multi-ethnic society. But I don't think that it's sort of, it's just that the people who are unhappy were excluded from the survey. I think it's that it's a really difficult thing, right? It's, I don't think it's a coincidence that democracy took hold in Europe in the wake of World War II at a moment of maximum ethnic homogeneity, right? And so it's in some ways a unique historical experiment to take these societies that are mono-ethnic and monocultural and say, look, you now need to accept that somebody who doesn't look like you is a German or an Italian or a Frenchman just as much as you. And I think what's clear is that there's deep, deep resistance to that in parts of the society, and that that goes beyond immigration. It's a much more fundamental question, because a lot of the people who are not co-ethnics are already in those societies. They're not going to go away. And I think that's one of the deepest things that I'm worried about. I like the story by Bertrand Russell about the chicken. He says there's a chicken on a farm, and all of the other animals on the farm will keep warning it and saying, one day the farmer's going to come and kill you. And the chicken will say, what are you talking about? All my life, the farmer came and was very nice to me, and muttered some encouraging words. Why on earth would he suddenly turn around and kill me? And Russell, in his nice wry tone, writes that, of course, one day the farmer does wring its neck, and more sophisticated views as to the nature of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. But what the story is doing is to call our attention to scope conditions, right? And there's sort of two scope conditions that haunt me. The first is that all through the history of democratic stability, you've had this rapid increase in living standards, as I was saying in the talk. But the second is that it may be that multi-ethnic democracy is more difficult to achieve than we've wanted to admit, especially in countries that have always defined themselves as mono-ethnic and monocultural. So on that front, I actually think the United States still does have an advantage over most of Western Europe. And we'll see the degree to which people are capable of changing their conceptions, of they accept somebody who's not, whose ancestors aren't from there as a true Italian or a true Frenchman or a true Swede. And I'm genuinely unsure about where it's going. I'm realizing this is a very long answer, but I'm going to say one more thing in response. So in Germany, there was a poll in the early 90s by Allensbach, big German pollster, and they asked, when somebody born and raised in Germany, his parents are Turkish, is he more German or more Turkish? Now, first thing you'll notice that that's a weird way of putting the question. No American pollster would ask that question. It says something about the country that you ask a question that way. But in 1992, 37% of Germans said more German. They ran the poll again last year, December 2016. 37% of Germans said more German. So the German notion of whether a Turkish second-generation immigrant is German hasn't changed in a quarter century, and most of them don't really think of him as German. That's really worrying.
So, thank you. A very interesting presentation. One of the things that I wonder about, though, is in terms of your indicators of deconsolidation, is that it all takes place pretty much at the mass level, and sort of in between the masses and the populist dictator or would-be populist dictator, Mr. Trump or somebody else, there's a whole layer of institutions and elites and veto points, particularly in a country like the United States, but also in Europe. So do you have any thoughts about how, and one other thing I would say is that the comparator cases, I know about Venezuela, for example. I mean, there simply weren't very many. There were elites, of course, but there weren't very many intervening institutions that could put up a strong resistance to the drift toward authoritarianism. So I guess my question is, do you have any thoughts about how the undertow of popular discontent translates at some point into either a liberal democracy or just a dictatorship? I mean, there's something, it seems to me that there are mechanisms missing in your argument that I'm just wondering if you've thought about.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, in the book, I talk a lot more than I could in the presentation about the ways in which democratic norms are going away at elite level as well. And I mentioned it briefly with the filibuster and things like that. You know, one of the things that really struck me in the United States was North Carolina, right? I mean, the fact that not only for many years has there been, you know, disenfranchisement through closing of polling booths and ID laws and so on, but, you know, after a close-run election, the outgoing legislature that was Republican, in order to react to the fact that a Democrat had narrowly won the governorship, rewrote the job description and abolished a whole bunch of the rights that the governor has. I mean, that means that you no longer accept that elections are the way we decide who rules the country, or the state in that case. I mean, it's a really, really striking violation of democratic norms by an elite group, GOP legislators, who aren't, by the way, particularly Trumpists. This wasn't, you know, Donald Trump's new wave of whatever legislators are doing. These are people who've been in the North Carolina legislature for decades in most cases, right? So that is a fundamental breakdown of democratic norms among a pretty large elite group in a way that I found, you know, frankly breathtaking. Now, I take your point about intervening institutions, and Dan and I were talking about that a little bit on the way over. It's in part the federal nature of the United States, and it's the fact that that it's more difficult for the state to have leverage over private citizens as well, right? I mean, in Poland and Hungary, state employment is much bigger than it is in the United States. The state has many more ways of ruining your private livelihood. A much larger swath of the media landscape is state-run, right? So there are all kinds of ways in which those governments had more tools that could be redeployed by a populist against democracy than the United States. And so I think that that we are seeing over the last 2 months checks and balances so far working quite well. I mean, in Poland, within a couple of weeks of peace taking office, the Supreme Court was neutralized. Here, so far, the judiciary has been holding up well. I don't know. We will see how it goes, right? I mean, one way of putting this question is that there's sort of two theories about what you need for a stable liberal democracy. And one is that you need a good system of checks and balances. And the other is that you need broad consensus about these democratic norms. And so, you know, Immanuel Kant is on the side of a former, right? Like even a race of devils can govern itself given the right institutions. People like Machiavelli are more on the side of a latter because, you know, and the founding fathers are more on the side of a latter, actually. They really think you need a democratic spirit for it to work, a Republican spirit. And so we're going to see, right? I think you can run the case one way and you can run the case the other way. I mean, we're sort of in a predicament now where there was dueling op-eds a few months ago between Dan Acemoglu and Frank Fukuyama. And Acemoglu thinks we don't have the institutions to resist, and Fukuyama thinks we do. I don't know. I take your point, and it's a source of optimism, and I think it's an important point to make. But we haven't been there yet. We'll see.
Yeah.
Other questions?
Hi, so my background is in IR, so I'm going to ask a very IR question, which is, what about the Cold War? So to what extent do you think this can be explained by time elapsed since the end of the Cold War?
So there's a few ways of reading that question. One way is just sort of like how much of this, when you're looking specifically at the attitudinal shifts among young people, is that, Cold War and also the experience of fascism, right? That it's 20, 25 years ago, people would have had some experience in many countries of living in a communist regime, of still feeling that a communist regime is threatening them in some kind of way, and would obviously have had much closer parents and grandparents having had experience of either living under or fighting against totalitarian regimes. And so I think that's obviously one of the things that drove why people said, I care about living in a democracy, because I know what it means to live in the Soviet Union. I don't want to do that, right? I don't know how optimistic I find that reading, because I think that precisely for those same reasons, people may now be more open to political experiments and say, well, what could go wrong? How bad can it get? Because we don't have that lived experience or that recent familial experience. Sure, and then there's sort of another question around, in a more IR way, the Cold War as making it more difficult for countries to deviate from the regime form of the hegemon of their bloc, and also of prestige, right? I mean, all through the history of democratic stability, a liberal democracy has been the most wealthy and powerful country, with brief blips or moments of uncertainty, Britain and the United States. And now that's no longer the case, right? I mean, it's easy to look at the United States and see decline, and look at China and see the country sort of doing better and better. And thankfully, China is not an ideological model, because it's sort of too, it works well in practice, but it's a mess in theory, right? So it's not like, people are going to like start saying, well, let's have a Chinese political system in the United States. Completely unclear what that would mean. But that loss of prestige and national standing, I think, also matters for how people feel about the regime form. Yeah.
Over to Toby.
We're giving you a workout, Dan.
Yes.
Thank you, Yascha. This is a very interesting work, and I really appreciate that you're doing it. There are also other people who work on not necessarily democratic deconsolidation, but of course the vomiting type of politics that you referred to at the beginning. So I would like to invite you to relate your work to that of folks who work on a different concept, democratic capitalism or capitalist democracy. So I mean, thinking particularly on Wolfgang Strick's work, who says democratic capitalism is in crisis. Because you kind of bring in all this economic stuff and all this, the lack of promise for the rising living standards, etc. You bring it in. So, but the framing of your project is very much in terms of liberalism, democracy, different definitions of democracy, etc. So I would like you to, I guess, either compare and contrast, or basically push your comparative advantage a little bit. Then another person who's writing a book, and I'm not sure where she is at, is Sherry Berman. And of course, these scholars, just like you essentialize different things to get some comparative leverage, or to get not comparative leverage, but also you have to abstract. So I hear you talk about German culture, and I'll cringe. Because you have used these concepts that I would never aggregate, and that's I think what Bob also said. But these other scholars aggregate different things. So they use other concepts. Streeck uses this capitalism as a concept. So in Sherry Berman's work,
you have to explain why you cringe about Germany for.
The culture business, when you talk about a national culture, I find that I cringe over that. The aggregation. I think Bob talk about the level of mass politics, and I have a bit of a hard time. You pressed a lot into this one question, and I cringe in reading from that one question without contextualizing it and without it's pretty reductionist to me. But we can talk about that later, hopefully. But the point with Sherry Berman's work, and what I found interesting in her work, is that she finds a real problem with social democracy as the way of managing the tensions between capitalism and democracy in a common vision for what we want to be. And like you talk about multi-ethnicity as a concept, but she talks about this common vision, about the narrative of what the good life is, and if we can, as a populace, relate to it. And that's a different thing than multi-ethnicity. I mean, many ethnicities could come together behind a vision of a good life. So I guess the question is, after saying all these things, is could you relate your work to the work of Streeck and Berman and saying where yours is better or provides more leverage?
Yeah, easy task. No, let me start this with a plug, which is that I started a new podcast, which I would love all of you to listen to, called The Good Fight, and you can find it on iTunes. And one of my recent guests was Sherry, who's fantastic and has lots of interesting things to say in her academic work, but also on the podcast. So I'm trying to think of how to relate it to Sherry's work. And I've been talking a lot with Sherry about, how to make sense of this political moment. I mean, you're right that there is a loss of animating common vision, which both helps to explain the deep crisis that social democratic parties are in. I mean, I essentially think social democracy is now dead. I mean, it no longer exists. Sure. I mean, certainly as an institutional form, it is on its last legs. And so I think there is a loss of common vision, which both explains why social democratic parties don't do very well, but it's also, the problem is that they become obsolete because they no longer offer a common vision, right? So it's a sort of, it goes both ways. And there is a question as to why that's happened, and perhaps some of the drivers of that are sort of more deep structural drivers, right? And so one of the things that I think is interesting is thinking about, what social democratic parties always had to do in order to win was to have this quite strange coalition between, the working class and urban, educated professionals. And what you've seen in a whole number of countries is that coalition just fraying very, very badly. It's fraying most obviously in systems that have proportional representation. So I'm going to caricature German culture some more. So when I was in Pforzheim, in southwest Germany during the regional election campaign, I went with a childhood friend who's in the Social Democratic Party and was sort of campaigning, and I listened to his conversations, and he kept having one of two conversations over and over. Either somebody sort of upper middle class came up to him and said, why aren't you guys cosmopolitan enough? Why aren't you guys clearer on welcoming the refugees? Why aren't you guys, pushing for same-sex marriage? I'm going to go and vote for the Greens. Or you had people who were more working class saying, well, you care more about these refugees than you care about us, and why do you keep going on about these social issues? I'm going to go and vote for the alternative for Germany, right? And so it's a really clear indication of how this coalition is sort of splitting apart. And you see that in Brexit. You see that obviously in the fact that Clinton did very well, among university faculty and in Manhattan and so on, and did poorly in sort of more working class parts of the country like Michigan, which you lost, right? So that's a huge challenge. How do you provide a common narrative to these different groups that have drifted apart both socioeconomically because of a society that's growing more unequal, and in terms of biography? Why did Willy Brandt manage to do that? Well, in part because when I think of somebody like my mom, who's a musician, who very much lives in a sort of urban, not especially affluent, but sort of, upper middle class sort of cultural milieu or something, right? Her dad was a printer who sent the newspaper letter by letter, right? And that was true of very many people in her generation. But even if they were teachers in the city or whatever, they had family who had been workers. And so there was a natural affinity there. But now that the story of social mobility, the big expansion of the middle class 50 years ago, right? And that's going back and further back. And we might know, well, my great-grandparent or whatever, perhaps my grandparent. It's not a relevant experience in the same way that some of the sociological conditions for that coalition is fraying. And there's growing socioeconomic inequality. Some of the social issues are more salient, right? And you take all of those together, and I do think that's a driver of that. Now, speaking to the question around Wolfgang Streeck and so on, I think that in some ways it's different levels of analysis, perhaps, right? So perhaps one way of saying it is that you don't necessarily, I disagree with Streeck on a bunch of things, but you could, in theory, do a super theory that includes both of those. And he perhaps is most interested in the deepest drivers of it, and I'm more interested in actually describing how this manifests itself and what that means about how the system might go in the future, right? And there's slightly different levels of analysis. Is that one way of putting it? I also don't quite know. I'm not an expert on this political economy stuff. I'm a little skeptical on this sort of capitalism is on its last legs because you keep having to rescue it in this kind of way and so on. Sure, it keeps changing form. I don't know that the right way of cashing that out is that it keeps being rescued in one last desperate ploy, which is sort of his narrative strategy around it, right? So I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that I buy that. So I think he sees, I think, a deeper crisis of capitalism, and I see a more narrow crisis of the foundations of our political system. Yeah.
We have a few more minutes, so Abbas.
Thank you so much for. I have a question. It's kind of counterfactual questions about what if. Imagine the United States has been succeeded in imposing liberal democracy in Iraq, because we all know the Iraq War is about liberal democracy. It's one of the reasons, one of the causes of that led the Iraq War. Beside the weapon of mass destruction, connection with Al-Qaeda, there is a liberal democracy. Do you think if the United States succeeded in Iraq, we will see this? Because for me, I would argue there is a strong relationship between the rising of populism and the Iraq War, the war that supported for more than 80% of the public of American publics. Do you think if the imagine in that way, the Iraq War has something to do with the rising of populism or something make some causal mechanism between these two? Yeah.
If that was the case, I guess the difficult question to answer is why is it that this takes over in 2016 and not in 2008, right? What you get in 2008 is a very popular political candidate who's not populist, but runs in good part on his opposition to the Iraq War and gets elected and rules, if anything, as a technocrat, right? And then you get the populism in reaction to that anti-Iraq war technocratic president. So that makes that story sort of seem a little bit difficult for me. Look, I think perhaps it's a question of prestige a little bit. If liberal democracy was sort of the huge success story everywhere in the world, if China had become a liberal democracy 10 years ago and was now thriving hugely, would that make a difference? I'm not even that sure. Probably kind of, because I do think that prestige question and so on matters a little bit. But I also think that people in Michigan are not voting because of Iraq or China. They're voting because they're pissed off about it. Complicated figuring out what exactly we're pissed off about. I think there's a real question around how big is the economic story, how big is the race story, and what ways do they go together, and what ways perhaps do they counteract. That's a question that I have an argument about and so on, but I think we're still all puzzling through it. But it seems to me that those things have a bigger role than Iraq or China or something. If I was going to tell a long-term story, it would be something about something even more long-term, which is about a sort of second effect that the social media has. So I think when you think about American history, America is founded as a republic rather than a democracy, as we all know. One of my favorite texts to teach is, I'm sure somebody here will be able to tell me, Federalist 65, something like that, where they're saying the real distinction between a republic and a democracy is that in a democracy, in a republic, which is what we're founding, obviously, there is emphasis, total exclusion of the people in their collective capacity from any share in the government. It's always fun to teach to 18-year-olds. Excuse me, this is what... but so America is not refounded as a democracy, but then in the 19th century it's sort of redescribed as a democracy, without that much institutional change, actually. And that sort of democratic myth works in part because you can't have direct democracy. You can actually have more forms of direct democracy than people want to admit at the time, but you can't have straightforward direct democracy, right? So like John Adams writes, there's too many of us that we could all ever like get together in the same place, and we're too far apart that to sort of travel there, right? So the best we can do is to send representatives in our place. And that's a way of redescribing the system in a sort of more democratic form. And that sort of myth works for a long time. People are like, yeah, we live in a democracy because I get to vote and so on. And I think there's something about the world of social media and the world of the internet where it's not that people want to have direct democracy. I don't believe in any of that, digital direct democracy stuff. I don't think people want to vote on like tiny regulations about healthcare that they don't understand, right? Like they want to be left alone from politics. But I do think that they recognize that, look, I know what it is to vote on something. I like click like on Facebook and like a little button lights up. I know what it is to vote on something. It's like American Idol, and like depending on my vote, somebody wins or loses that day. There's something so direct and immediate to it that I think part of this democratic myth has eroded. But people sort of think like, how is this? They're not letting us say what we want. What we want isn't happening. So I think there is a long-term story where some of the mystique of democracy has gone away in that more complicated way. But that seems to me a more plausible story than making it about Iraq and so on. Yeah.
Joe. And then Lauren, you have a question? Actually, let's collect the two and make those the last two. Okay, so you ask yours and then Lauren.
So my question pertains to the future of democracy in this nation, in particular, and your role in that as a member of the press. So like publications like Slate, like they don't call balls and strikes consistently. They often like to put ideology first at the price of sometimes being hypocritical. So my question with that is, wouldn't that harm civil society's ability to hold leaders in positions of power to account when actual scandals occur? And would that not be the long-term threat to the health of our democracy? Like the faith and the credibility of the media.
Okay, take one more.
Mm-hmm.
So my question also pertains to civil society. What I've noticed is, so in the wake of Trump, we had the Women's March on Washington, right? And we have this overwhelming amount of people taking to the street to protest. We've seen that with Black Lives Matter. We've seen that with the climate march that's going to be coming up in a few months. But what we've also seen at the same time is very low numbers of voter turnout of young people. So on your third scenario of the rejuvenation, the hope in the future, I'm curious if you can sort of elaborate on how that's going to play out with, yes, we have seen this rise of protest movement, but we've also seen historically low numbers.
Yeah. Look, I don't entirely accept the premise of your question. It's not going to surprise you. But look, I think you got to distinguish between a couple of things, right? The first is that we're just going to have disagreement over some things, right? And you can see people, I read people in the Wall Street Journal, say, which I tend to disagree with, right? But I can accept that they are, in a conscientious manner, trying to describe the world as they see it and trying to argue for the things they believe in from their perspective, good reasons. Now, I can think they're wrong without thinking they're dishonest, right? And then I think that there's a swath of the media that sees a very clear goal that they're pursuing, and that is willing to say whatever they want in order to push that goal. And they're willing to lie about things, they're willing to make up fake scandals and so on. So, if you are, I'm assuming that you're more conservative than Slate, let's say, from your question. I don't want to make presumptions, but it sounds that way. Sorry? Right. So what I'm trying to say is that I think I would ask you to try and extend the same interpretive charity to media that you disagree with, that I try to extend to something like the Wall Street Journal, and saying that even in moments when I disagree, even in moments when I think they don't recognize why something is a scandal that I think is a scandal, and they think that something is a scandal that really isn't a scandal, they have reasons why they see the world differently, and it's worth taking that seriously. And then there's other media that are pure outlets of propaganda who are willing to lie. Now, I'm not saying that there might not be examples of that where people get things wrong, or particular journalists. I think that if you're a fair-minded reader of the mainstream liberal press, you will see that even, perhaps they have everything wrong, perhaps you disagree with everything they're saying, but by and large, these are honest people who are describing the world as they see it and trying to argue for the things that they sincerely believe. And I think trying to extend that kind of courtesy to each other is one of the fundamental things we need to reestablish in order to have a healthy democratic discourse. Turnout. So, look, I mean, it's one of the reasons, the skepticism that I hear in your question is one of the reasons why I'm slightly skeptical that the optimistic scenario is what we're going to get. In the short run, I think that might not be a problem, right? I mean, I think in 2008, you had pretty good youth turnout. And that's because you had an inspiring candidate, and the candidate was inspiring in part. I mean, there's many reasons why he was inspiring, but in part because he's running against an extremely unpopular president. There's a chance that 2020 will look like that, right? By no means guaranteed. The Democrats got to nominate the right person, and it has to be the case that people actually recognize some of the bad things in his presidency, and I'm not yet 100% sure that that'll be the case. I think it's perfectly possible that Trump will be popular in 2020. But it's not unlikely that those conditions will come together, and if they do, then I'm not worried about turnout in 2020. But 2022, 2024, 2026, I mean, especially the midterms, yeah, I mean, I think it's a real problem. And I think, so perhaps this sets me up to sort of end on a broader note. I mean, all through the history of not just democracy, but of any attempt at self-government, I mean, from ancient Athens, through Rome, through the Italian city-states, through the early American Republic, there was a deep awareness that forming people to be citizens and to be believers in the political system is one of the fundamental tasks of society, and especially of educators and intellectuals. And I think one of the things we've lost, and one of the things that actually academics have often lost, intellectuals have often lost, and writers have often lost, is an awareness that that's part of our role, that yes, we should criticize, yes, we should point out the injustices in the world, yes, we should point out what's bad in our system, and there's plenty of that, and we need to reform it, we need to improve it. But one of our tasks is to teach people what's good about our system. It's to teach people why, even though our political system has certain flaws, it is better than the alternatives that are out there. And the only way that we can make sure that young people get engaged in politics, involved in politics, is to correct some of the real problems in it, but also to go back to seeing that as the mission of society, to actually instill people the fact that democracy is vulnerable and that it needs to be defended, and that we need to argue for it and stand up for it. And I think this is hopefully a teaching moment that might accomplish some of that in young people, but also accomplish perhaps that change of what we take our role to be, all of us in this room. Whether it will be, we'll see.
Well, Yascha, when you came, there was an oppressive downpour of rain, but the clouds have now parted. The sun has come out, but yet I feel more depressed. So I don't know what to make of that, except to say...
But I ended on such an inspiring note.
Yes, yes. But except to say that I want to thank you, and in a second we'll all thank you for a really profoundly thoughtful and insightful talk that I think will leave all of us thinking about these issues. And speaking of which, before we do thank you, I just wanted to say we'll pass these out on the way, but this was an introduction, in a sense, this event today, to our workshop next week. We're going to have a day-long academic workshop on the theme of democracy in danger, where we're having a dozen or so academics working on this topic in different countries around the world coming together. That's going to be in the library on the 4th floor of the main library on College Ave. And so hopefully some of you can join us there as well. But now please just join me in thanking our speaker, Yascha Mounk.